Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Strategic Advisor for Hospitality and Leadership at Airbnb, Chip Conley.
Hello. So, it's great to be here again at Skift. So I'm actually going to be taking my Airbnb hat off a little bit today. I'm going to be telling you my own perspective on where the travel industry is going. I've been lucky enough in my 32 years of being in the travel industry to have seen two waves. One of them I saw when I was 26 years old, and that was the boutique hotel wave. And I had the eyes somehow to see it. And then 52 boutique hotels later, at age 52, another wave hit me, but I didn't see it coming. And that was when Brian Chesky at Airbnb called me 5.5 years ago to join him and his co-founders on this journey. So I'm going to take you surfing with me today. I'm going to help you see that you can be a really bad surfer in your late 50s. That's me. But one of the things that's interesting about surfing is as you get better at surfing and you look out to the horizon, you can tell which is the wave you want to take. And that's the same with an entrepreneur who can see the difference between a long-term trend and a short-term fad. So Joie de Vivre, a company I started at age 26, 52 boutique hotels, definitely saw the wave of boutique hotels coming along. Airbnb didn't see it, but had enough, luck to say yes to Brian when he said, there's this trend happening, I want to take you on the journey with us. So I'm your surf instructor today, and I'm going to start with a quote from an author named William Gibson. The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. It's a beautiful quote to speak to the idea of disruption, beautiful quote to speak to the idea that quite often there's some foreshadowing of the future, but only some people can see it. And that's another way of saying having that expert surfer eyes to be able to see the right kind of wave. So here are after my era at both Joie de Vivre and Airbnb, so just so everybody knows, if you don't know me well, 4 years as the head of global hospitality and strategy at Airbnb and Brian Chesky's in-house mentor, although he mentored me as much as I mentored him. And then a year and a half now as strategic advisor. So it means I have more time to try to learn to surf. So these are the 3 rules of innovation that I think are relevant to any industry. I set them up partly for myself as a frame to show you some history of how innovations happened, as well as to then speak to the future. First of all, an innovation doesn't typically arrive without some foreshadowing. I'll show you some of that. Number 2 is innovations usually address an underlying human need that the establishment has not met. And then thirdly, over time, the establishment embraces the innovations and that represent a long-term trend. So that is, I think, a frame to sort of consider as we look at some of these innovations. So let me take you on a history lesson and show how that worked. You could sort of see Holiday Inn coming along, and then all these other hotel brands who really all started as motor lodge hotels or motor hotels. And it had a lot to do with the fact servicemen came back from World War II. They had traveled all over the world. They came back to the United States. They got married, became baby boomers, or had their baby boomer kids. Eisenhower created an interstate highway system, so it was easier to travel. And what people wanted, people who were new to travel, what they were looking for was predictability. And absolutely predictability and ubiquity was what the big hotel chains were offering. Fast forward 30 years. These are the two, they're sort of like my patron saints in the boutique hotel business. Bill Kimpton and Ian Schrager was here yesterday. Again, often the pioneers in an industry are not from in the industry. Bill Kimpton was an investment banker. Ian Schrager, as you know, was he was Studio 54 owner, co-owner. What they saw was predictability 30 years later was not the only thing that customers wanted. How did they see it? Partly because they saw in retail that Sears and Montgomery Wards in the 1980s were starting to not do so well, partly because boutiques, niche-oriented players came along. The name boutique hotel came from that. And long story short is, what we now know about boutique hotels is we're way past that third phase. because the establishment jumped on this bandwagon, whether it was Barry Sternlicht starting W for Starwood, or ultimately Ian Schrager joining Marriott for the Edition collection, or Intercontinental buying Kimpton. All right, now let's talk about Airbnb, or home sharing. Now, the thing that I did know 5.5 years ago when Brian called me and said, Chip, I want you to help us democratize hospitality, is I knew that hospitality boutique hotels had done something that was a precursor to Airbnb. Otherwise, to be honest with you, I was an idiot. I did not see the home sharing wave coming. But I did see this. Boutique hotels created a more adventurous traveler. People were willing to actually try something for the experience. They wanted to actually say, you know what, I want to have that live like a local kind of experience, which is what a boutique hotel, if it's doing its job well, can do. So boutique hotels were just a precursor to the idea of people experiencing local, that kind of local personalized hospitality flavor. Okay, that's one data point. These other data points I got from a couple of the board members at Airbnb who I happened to know when Brian reached out to me. VRBO and Craigslist were both started in 1995, and they were both all about renting space out, typically to a stranger. In the case of VRBO, it was your vacation home. But people have been renting out vacation homes way before VRBO ever started, but VRBO became sort of famous for their platform, although their platform was very, very different than what Airbnb ultimately became. Craigslist also started in 1995. Craig Newmark needed a roommate for his apartment. He had a two-bedroom apartment, and he needed a roommate. So there was some, Airbnb did not start the idea of renting space to a stranger. They just popularized it, made a much better UX experience, and focused on primary homes in urban markets. And then home swapping. I've never home swapped, but I have a lot of friends who do it, and they do it religiously. When do you think home swapping started? Maybe 20 years ago? Wrong. It started in 1953. And it was the Dutch and the Swiss Teachers Union, where people, they knew their teachers didn't get a lot of money, didn't get paid a lot of money, but they got their whole summer off, and they wanted to make travel less expensive. And so home swapping was another opportunity to say, yes, people are open to staying in someone else's home who's a stranger. All right, so now let's talk about the future. So I'm going to tell you about 4 trends that are intriguing to me and some companies that I'm intrigued by. I'm speaking for myself. I am not speaking for Airbnb. So do not misquote me, because this is just my point of view. And it's not because Airbnb, there's nothing wrong with Airbnb on these things. I'm just saying this is just Chip. I think personalization is a huge trend. We all know about that. The question is, how do you tap into it? There's a company that I'm not going to talk much about here because it's not one of the 4, but sort of honorable mention, and it's sort of in beta phase still, so I feel cautious talking about it. But wouldn't it be interesting if independent and boutique hotels around the world didn't have to figure out the personalization thing, but they could just tap into a platform where you as a guest give your personal preferences and your travel archetype and taste of what you like to do when you're on the road to this one platform, and that platform then connected to all the independent boutique and lifestyle hotels around the world. And so when you showed up at that hotel, they knew everything about you and knew what kind of things they should recommend for you. That's in the process of being built in Israel right now with a company called Xander. But that's all I'm going to say about that one, because it's in very early phase. But it's pretty interesting what they're doing. So my 4, here's the first one. The first 2 relate to younger people. The second 2 relate to older people. First one's the boutique rental operators. Now, something was mentioned about this. I think Deanna asked Greg Greeley yesterday about this. I think this is an interesting trend. It's almost like Joie de Vivre meets Airbnb. It's a boutique experience, but in an apartment. And it's usually, most of these companies have multiple units within a building. Sometimes they've actually literally changed the zoning or the land use such that it's actually got a hotel license. But what's interesting about this is if you think about it, and a lot of you are using your phones right now, when you're traveling, you use your phone. You use your phone, and then you get to the hotel, and the hotel isn't really ready to actually have you use your phone. What I mean by that is the services that you get experience in a hotel are generally not mobile friendly. The hotels are getting better at this in terms of texting opportunities, but the truth is when you create a company like these ones, all recent companies, and you build it for mobile, you can actually create an experience so that when you get to your accommodations, everything is still mobile friendly in terms of what you need. And it also taps into the idea of extended stay. I think extended stay is only going to grow. It's one of the fastest growing segments in lodging, but it's going to grow because you'll see the next trend is part of the reason it's going to grow a lot more. So I think this is an interesting trend. I think these are players who are actually, in essence, creating boutique hotels, but with sort of a home sharing kind of flavor. Secondly, digital nomad travel. The future of travel is pre-mobile, pre-having your smartphone, you traveled, and if you didn't have a Wi-Fi connection, you just sort of had excuses for you couldn't actually be reached when you were traveling as easily. Today, you can't have that excuse. You're traveling, but unless you're in a place that doesn't have Wi-Fi, people expect you to be available all the time. Millennials, and I say it in the broader term, younger people, but not just younger people, people who have a younger perspective, are more outwardly mobile than they are upwardly mobile. And what that means is they're more interested in going and seeing the world than climbing the corporate ladder. Programs like Remote Year, which takes people on a 12-month sojourn, 75 people, and they go as a cohort to 12 different cities for a month each. Most of the people who are going on that are actually working while they're doing it. Same with We Roam. And then the third one's Nomad House, not the hotel. And that's basically co-living, co-working, co-living all together. This is a long-term trend because absolutely millennials have said, we're not going to live by the three-stage life of the past where you learn, then you earn, then you retire. We're going to actually enjoy learning and earning and all at the same time. Thirdly, medical tourism. I don't have a specific company to talk about here because there's a lot of hospitals and hospitality companies that are actually combining on this. This is a trend that's growing at 20% annually today, and by 2021 will be a $50 billion business, and very few companies have tapped into it. It's been mostly the hospitals that are focused on it and not the hospitality side of it. Big trend, tapping into three foreshadowing elements. Number one is we're going to live longer, so people are actually having to do procedures more. Number two is healthcare in this country is extremely expensive. And number three is the developing world has a growing number of doctors and a medical system that actually have all been trained in places like the US and then gone back to their home countries. Okay, finally, this is the fourth one, Midlife Wisdom School. That sounds really abstract, but it's the one I'm most excited about of these four. That's me on the far right side, jumping in the air. Let me explain this. This is transformational travel applied to midlife. So the first two were about millennials, the third, medical tourism, and this one are about people in midlife and beyond. What is this about? Well, transformational travel as a term has gotten sort of bastardized, to be honest with you. What transformational travel is meant to mean is that you got transformed in some fundamental way by your travel experience. Well, what's interesting to me, as we go to the next slide, I was writing a book that I just came out last week when I went to this, to this strategic advisor role to Airbnb. It gave me some space to, surf and write a book. And as I wrote the book, I talked to so many people in midlife who were completely bewildered by the fact that power is moving 10 years younger in our society, and yet we're all going to live 10 years longer. And so there's a 20-year irrelevancy gap that's been created in midlife. And yet there's nothing out there that says, how do you repurpose yourself in midlife? So that led me to imagining what's called the Modern Elder Academy. So it actually opened in January of this year. It's week-long and two-week-long programs. It's in Mexico. It's 1 hour north of Cabo San Lucas in Baja California Sur. And it's been off the charts successful in terms of just applicants, attendance, et cetera. It opens, again, it's closed right now for the sort of hot season down there, but opens again in November. And long story short is, what's fascinating about this is people are actually getting transformed in a one-week experience. So, when you know a trend's working, or it's maybe long-term, another person in the world is doing the same thing you're doing, but you haven't talked to them yet. This is Will Travis. Will Travis was the executive chairman of Sid Lee, which is one of the largest advertising agencies in North America. They created the C2 conference in Montreal with Cirque du Soleil. really creative guy. I didn't know him. I'd met him a couple years ago when I spoke at C2, but about a year ago, he reached out to me and said, I hear you're doing this Modern Elder Academy. I've created something called the Elevation Barn, and he's doing exactly the same thing that we're doing, but he's doing it in Bali and in northern New York. So long story short is, when you start seeing people who are sort of creative types doing these things together, you've got to actually notice the trend. My 15 minutes is up, 15 minutes of fame on the stage here, but let me say, the thing that's interesting is 40 years ago, next year, Canyon Ranch was created by a guy named Mel Zuckerman. He was an LA-based developer whose health was failing, but so he wanted to go to a spa, and while spas have been around for thousands of years, all the spas that he went to were sort of mostly oriented toward women and more pampering. So he created Canyon Ranch 40 years ago. And Canyon Ranch became, in essence, the category for destination spa resorts. It sort of created the category. And destination spa resorts are a huge business 40 years later. I do believe, this is part of the Modern Elder Academy campus, there's a 3-acre campus on the beach. I do believe the future is definitely going to be about how do we help people in midlife repurpose themselves, and I think a midlife wisdom school is a long-term trend as a result. One of the collateral benefits of having a resort or a little retreat down in Baja is I'm getting better at my surfing. So the next time I see you, maybe I'll have better pictures. So thank you very much for letting me come and give me that.